This is one of the world's smallest full-frame mirrorless cameras, and it offers some of the wildest features and specs you can find in a camera of this price and size, though the likelihood is you may not have even heard of it. This is called the Sigma FPL, and yes, we are talking about the same Sigma that makes those high-quality lenses we all know and love. Well, it turns out that they make cameras too, and have done for quite some time now. But when Sigma make a new camera, they never seem to just be able to release a run-of-the-mill camera. Oh no, they end up making something that's a little bit unusual and fairly innovative, to be fair, and this FPL is no exception to that rule. And as a result, this FPL actually has a very, very dedicated following, and I should know because I inadvertently crossed paths with these people a few years ago, and let's say it didn't go so well for me, but I'll explain more of that story a little bit later on. So, if this camera has such a die-hard following and a bunch of impressive features to boot, then why aren't more people talking about it? Well, let's start by looking at arguably one of the biggest selling points of this camera, and that's its full-frame sensor. Now, this isn't just any old sensor. This is a 61 megapixel beast, and although Sigma have never officially confirmed it, it's pretty much the worst kept secret on the internet that this is the same 61 megapixel Sony chip that's used in the A7R Mark IV. This means you're getting super high resolution images that you can crop in for days without losing any image quality, and the raw files offer bags of dynamic range all packed into this tiny, almost pocketable camera body. Now, we'll dive more into the images that this camera can capture a little bit later on, but obviously the small size also means that it's incredibly lightweight, and it weighs just 420 grams or just 15 ounces. This clearly has a number of benefits, the most obvious being that it's super portable, so I wanted to see just how plausible this camera would be as a powerful travel camera when I recently took it with me on a trip to Alberta in Canada. Now, I should come clean at this point and say that I have actually reviewed this camera 3 years ago when it was first released, and I'll be honest and say I wasn't a huge fan of it for reasons we'll get into a bit later. In fact, after pointing out my dissatisfaction with this camera in my original review video, that's when I ran into the FP fans, and oh boy, those guys do not like hearing bad things being said about their beloved FP. So much so that I actually ended up taking down that original review video over fears of being bitten in the street by a rabid FP fanatic. But I have since rewatched that video, and to be fair, on reflection, I probably was a little bit too hard on it. So when I was looking for a camera to take away with me on this upcoming trip, I figured it might be time to give the FPL another spin, because it's super small, has a great sensor, and perhaps Sigma have even ironed out some of the bugs. Well, first off, I can confirm that this camera is absolutely built for travel. Its intentionally simplistic nature, small size, and low weight means that it's perfect for slipping into carry-on luggage. Though it's also fair to say that a camera is only really as portable as the lens that it's paired with, and with only enough space to take one lens with me, I did decide to bring along this Sigma 35mm f2 DGDN. Although this lens is far from being a pancake lens, it's still relatively small and lightweight, and as I've said numerous times in the past, I am a huge fan of the 35mm focal length as it's just so versatile. Now, I can sense that when I mentioned I only took a single prime lens with me on this trip, a number of your buttholes puckered up ever so slightly, and maybe that's because you're thinking, why didn't I go for something like a small zoom lens instead, because surely that would offer way more flexibility. And whilst you'd certainly be correct in saying that, one of the benefits of shooting with a 61 megapixel sensor is that it gives you so much real estate to play around with in terms of resolution, and that means you can make some pretty extreme crops in post and still end up with large enough images for prints and posting online without really losing any image quality. So you almost don't ever need a zoom with this camera. But if the idea of just cropping all of your images to suit sounds way too much work and you prefer to do that in camera, then you can do that too, because this FPL allows you to punch in as far as 2.5 times and still output perfectly usable 15 megapixel images. To put that into context, that effectively means that I can extend the focal range of this lens from 35mm to 88mm at any given time. In fact, this camera can actually go one step further because it maxes out at a 5 times digital zoom, but this will result in miniature 2.4 megapixel images, which, let's be honest, is probably an extreme you wouldn't ever use. But regardless, you can now all collectively release your buttholes in relief. Now, obviously, one downside downside to your camera spitting out 61 megapixel raw files is that they do take up a fair amount of space. In fact, the photos that I took on this were typically around 90 to 100 megabytes each. But don't let that put you off, because you do have options and you can output lower resolution raw files without the crop being applied, or you could just always shoot 61 megapixel JPEGs straight out of the camera instead, which means you will also retain the resolution whilst minimizing the file size. Now obviously shooting in JPEG will come at the cost of malleability when it comes to making adjustments afterwards, but if editing really isn't your thing anyway, then you could always try your hand at some of the filter effect modes on this camera, which are somewhat reminiscent of Fujifilm film simulations. Now, some of them I think are just a little bit too full on for my taste, but there are actually a few of them that are quite nice. I was personally a fan of the FOV classic blue mode for all of those cold snowy scenes. Before we move on entirely from sensor related stuff, I should also point out that there are unfortunately a few limitations to owning a camera of this size. For starters, there's no mechanical shutter, it's all electronic, and that means that you do have to contend with things like rolling shutter, which is that kind of jelly effect you get from panning shots. There's also no IBIS in this camera either, so shooting handheld at slow shutter speeds is probably best avoided, or you're going to have to stick to a tripod. Finally, there's no built-in EVF, though you do at least have the option to buy this external one that bolts onto the side. And actually it's quite a nice thing to own, because I particularly like how the viewfinder can flip up and down to aid with shooting at lower angles, and that's particularly handy considering that the rear screen is fixed in place. Though sadly this EVF is not completely without fault, because firstly it's a bit of a faff to get on and off, and it does cause the camera to be fairly unbalanced because now all of the weight is pulling on the opposite side to where your hand is gripping on. But arguably the most annoying thing about this EVF is that in order for it to work, it has to plug into the USB-C port on the side, which is the only means of charging this camera. Now Sigma have kindly put another USB-C port on the side of this EVF, but unfortunately you can't charge the camera through it, so you do have to keep taking this on and off more times than you would like, and ultimately that meant that I just ended up leaving it at home. Now speaking of charging the camera, the battery life on this camera, it really isn't all that fantastic, and unfortunately I found this out the hard way on the first day of my trip. So it turned out that whilst this FPL was being stored in my camera bag, it somehow managed to turn itself on, and in my opinion it's way too easy to do that because the switch is actually quite large and exposed on the top of the camera. Anyway, this meant that the battery had significantly drained itself, and after shooting with it for all of 5 minutes the battery had completely died, and stupidly I didn't have a spare battery with me either. Luckily though, being able to charge the camera via the USB-C port came in clutch, because I was able to charge it in the car whilst travelling to our next destination, and in fairness it charged pretty quickly too, so I wasn't all that mad about it. Also, I've got to say that the autofocus on this camera has been dramatically improved since I last used it. Before it was slow, inaccurate and borderline unusable. That is certainly not the case now. I mean sure, the tracking AF is a little bit hit and miss still, but by and large it's a significant upgrade over the last copy I reviewed. In fact, at no point did I miss a shot during my trip, and all of the photos I took were pin sharp and on target, so hats off for Sigma for actually putting this right. Now in terms of general build quality and handling, this is actually a pretty beautifully made camera. The metal finish feels very premium, and I love how chunky and tactile the buttons and dials are. My only gripe would be with this main command dial on the back here, because this thing doubles as a D-pad, and if you're rotating it too fast to adjust the shutter speed for example, you do occasionally end up pressing it and then just altering a completely different setting by mistake, which let me tell you is slightly infuriating. And you see, that is the thing with this camera. Ultimately, all of the things I've mentioned are just gripes, and every single camera has them, and usually stuff like this wouldn't be enough to put you off buying the camera at all. But in the case of the FPL, there are just so many of these little minor annoyances that after a time, they do start to test your patience. So if that's the case, then you're probably asking yourself, why do people love this camera so much? Well, one thing we haven't spoken about yet is the video specs, and this is where things get very spicy. This pocket-sized camera is able to capture 4K video in 12-bit RAW, which is pretty insane. Now for those who are currently scratching their heads wondering what the hell all of that means, basically when you shoot in 4K RAW, this camera is chucking out a RAW image for every single frame of that video recording. Now if the video is shot at 24 or 25 frames per second, that's up to 25 RAW images per second for as long as you are recording. And each of these RAW files have the same flexibility when editing as the RAW files you would capture when shooting stills, so that offers an insane level of creative potential feel when it comes to editing afterwards. Now, obviously, generating that amount of raw files at that speed is just a hell of a lot of data. So in order for you to do that, you do need to attach an external SSD. If all of that sounds a little bit overkill for you, then you can also record in standard 8-bit MOV files. But unfortunately, there aren't any log modes on this camera, so you are stuck to using a fairly contrasty picture profile that certainly limits your color grading options in post. But video aside, what is the image quality like in terms of stills photography? Well, honestly, this is really about as good as it gets for a camera of this size. This 61 megapixel full frame sensor is well known for capturing stunning amounts of detail and amazing levels of dynamic range. And when placed inside of this tiny Sigma body, it makes such a powerhouse of a camera. Now, obviously, this isn't designed to be a sports photography camera, it's just not fast enough. But for slower paced types of photography like street, travel, portraits, and landscape, this camera really shines. Despite the gripes that I've mentioned, ultimately, I can get past all of that when at the end of the day, it delivers results that are just so high quality. Now, speaking of editing, I should also mention that all of the photos you've seen so far have been edited raw files using my brand new Lightroom presets that have also gone on sale on my equally brand new website. And at this point, I've got to say a big thank you to Pixper for sponsoring the build of this website, because I was able to build this entire website from scratch in just a few days by using their super easy to use platform. So if you're interested in buying my presets, then just head over to tomcalton.com and use the discount code Pixper to get 20% off my entire preset pack. Or if you want to learn more about how you can create your own website using Pixper, then you can follow the links in the description below. But anyway, at this point, you're probably dying to know, how much does this thing actually cost? Well, the cheapest price you're going to find online is buying this second hand. And currently on MPB, these are going for around $1,700, which I know is very, very pricey, but I actually think it's pretty insane value given the impressive video specs. However, if you're unlikely to ever want to capture 12-bit raw video, then this is where I kind of struggle to find a good enough reason to ever suggest buying this camera, particularly when you can buy a Sony A7R Mark IV, which includes the same exact sensor as this FPL and is only around $130 to $320 more, depending of course on the camera's condition. And for that extra money, you're going to get things like a built-in EVF, a flip-out screen, better autofocus features, better battery life, in-body image stabilization, log profiles for video. Honestly, the list goes on and on. But despite my inner monologue screaming at me at this point, telling me that the Sony A7R Mark IV is clearly the superior choice, there is certainly a part of me that really admires this camera and is kind of itching to go out shooting with it again. I don't know, maybe it's Stockholm Syndrome, or maybe it's because the Sigma FPL fan group have taken my daughter hostage in an attempt to silence this review. Or maybe, just maybe, I now kind of understand how special this groundbreaking camera is. No, it's definitely the hostage situation thing, isn't it? I should probably go and sort that out, actually.